But as staggering as all of that is, it actually obscures the severity of the problem for communities of color. As some sociologists have argued, the term mass incarceration itself is a misnomer because it implies that this is something that affects everybody, large groups of people, when in fact, mass incarceration has affected a relatively small slice of the American population. But within that demographic, it's taken nearly everybody. It was estimated several years ago that in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, 3 out of 4 young black men and nearly all those in the poorest neighborhoods could expect to serve time in prison. Rates of incarceration nearly as shocking can be found in other communities of color across America. So what accounts for all this? What accounts for the explosion in black imprisonment if not crime rates? Crime rates is the popular answer. If you ask politicians, they'll say, well, it's crime. It's all about crime. If we want to reduce incarceration rates, we need to bring down crime rates in the black community. But no, crime rates have actually had relatively little to do with incarceration rates. Crime rates have fluctuated over the past 30 years. Today are at historical lows, but incarceration rates have consistently soared. Most criminologists and sociologists today will acknowledge that crime rates and incarceration rates have moved independently of one another. Incarceration rates have consistently soared regardless of whether crime was going up or down in any given community or the nation as a whole. So what does explain this? Well, it turns out that the activists who post that sign on the telephone pole were right. The war on drugs. The war on drugs is the single greatest contributor to mass incarceration in the United States. Drug convictions alone accounted for about 2/3 of the increase in the federal system and more than half of the increase in the state prison system between 1985 and 2000, the period of the most rapid expansion of our prison system. Drug convictions alone have increased more than 1,000% since the drug war began. Now, most Americans violate drug laws in their lifetime. In fact, surveys indicate that the group most likely to have committed drug crimes are white professionals. That group, though, is the least likely to have ever been arrested or spent time in jail for a drug crime. For decades now, studies have shown that people of all colors use and sell illegal drugs at remarkably similar rates. In fact, where significant differences in the survey data can be found, it indicates that white youth are more likely to engage in illegal drug dealing than black youth. Now that defies our basic stereotypes about who drug dealers are. You think about a drug dealer, the typical image is of a black kid with his pants sagging down on the street corner. That's the image of drug dealing we have in our culture. But drug dealing happens in every community, on college campuses, universities. People of all colors use and sell drugs. But the enemy in this war has been racially defined. And the drug war, not by accident, has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color. In fact, in some states, 80 to 90% of those individuals sent to prison on drug offenses have been African American. 80 to 90%. Now, I find that many people are willing to concede the racial disparities once they see the data. But even so, they say, well, the drug war has a benign motive. The drug war is aimed at rooting out those violent offenders and the drug kingpins, and that's why the drug war is being waged in poor communities of color, because that's where the violent offenders and the drug kingpins can be found. In fact, it seems most people seem to imagine that the drug war was declared in response to the emergence of crack cocaine in inner city communities and the related violence. Not true. Not true. The war on drugs, the current drug war, is officially declared by President Ronald Reagan in 1982, before crack ever appeared in Los Angeles, and at a time when drug crime was actually on the decline, not on the rise. Now, it was President Richard Nixon who was first to coin the term a war on drugs, but it was President Ronald Reagan who turned that rhetorical war into a literal one. And at the time the drug war was declared, there was no hue and cry over drug crimes. It was not in response to overwhelming public concern about drug crime. No, from the outset, the drug war had far more to do with racial politics than drug use, abuse, or drug-related crime. There have now been numerous historians and sociologists, political scientists who have shown that the drug war was part of a grand and highly successful strategy, often termed the Southern strategy, of using racially coded political appeals on issues of crime and welfare to appeal to poor and working class white voters, particularly in the South, who were resentful of, threatened by, anxious about many of the gains of the civil rights movement. Poor and working class white voters, they had their worlds rocked by the civil rights movement. Wealthy whites could, send their kids to private schools to avoid desegregation orders and could give their kids all of the advantages that, wealth has to offer. But poor and working class whites were the ones who suddenly found that it was their kids who may be subject to busing orders. It was their kids or themselves who were suddenly forced to compete on equal terms for what appeared to be scarce jobs, and now forced to compete on equal terms with a group of people they had long been taught to believe were inferior to them. And this created enormous anxiety and fear and an opportunity for politicians to exploit our racial divisions for political gain. And pollsters and political strategists found that by using racially coded, get tough rhetoric on issues of crime and welfare, they could persuade those poor and working class white voters who had been part of the Democratic New Deal coalition to defect from the Democratic Party and join the Republican Party in droves. In the words of H.R. Haldeman, President Richard Nixon's former chief of staff, he said, quote, "The whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to," end quote.